Welcome to the Healing Station with Dr. Red. I am your host, Dr. Red, and we're here for another episode of our heart condition series. And today we will be talking about anger. And as usual, I got my co-host with me, Queen Sylvia Speaks. Girl, say hey, y'all. Say hey.
Hey everyone, and it's so great to be here. Glad for you all to join us. This is going to be such a unique episode. Talking about anger. Anger is
Mm.
something that we all have, that we all try to suppress, or some just act boastfully in. So let's get into it. Let's talk about it. I'm excited.
I wanted to start by just admitting that anger is probably it's a hard one for me personally. It's not one that I'm the most comfortable with. And as we talk through other feelings, like even fear and stuff like that, very familiar with those, more comfortable with those in a weird way. But with anger, I've always found myself at one point in my life, like priding myself in never getting angry, which I see now is problematic as I've understood anger. But just being a person that was like, no, I want to stay away from anger as much as possible. I want to deny anger as much as possible. But now, really truly understanding that anger is necessary and it's not a bad thing. And what I've realized is what I thought was anger in the past was really rage. And so seeing anger as rage and getting it misconstrued and seeing that believing that rage was really anger put me in a position to be like, I don't want to be angry. Because rage is when you see people lashing out or really being in this space that's honestly scary. And I was like, I don't want to be like that. And so I was like, I want to deny anger. Like, I don't want to feel that. But now understanding that rage is actually fear in a way that people respond to their fear to push people away and they become scary on purpose to push put a wall around that. I'm like, okay, help me to understand anger. And for my understanding right now, anger is more so it's very vulnerable because it is expressing what is important to you and what you're passionate about. And it also gives energy for change, whether that is like advocating for yourself or others, or just the energy it takes to really share your heart with other people and be vulnerable. And so that's how I see anger now, which makes me realize like, one, I am angry. And I am, and that's okay. And I can, you know, embrace that. And two, makes me realize that it's one of the most important feelings when I think of it that way. What are your thoughts?
I want to go back to rage. So you expressed that rage is not anger; it is
Mm-hmm.
actually fear that is expressed out. So I want to read this scripture, right? And I want
Mm-hmm.
you to give me your perspective on this. So this is John 2:14 through 17. In the temple courts, he, talking about Jesus, found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables. Those who sold doves, he said, get these out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a market, or my father's house will be a house of prayer. His disciples remember it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. So people can look at this, right, and be like,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's rage, right? Like that's he's flipping over tables, he's yelling at people, all of the things like that. Kind of what do you think what is the feeling or what is happening in this moment?
That's a really good question. As I think about that at first glance, to be honest, I see like a mixture of anger and rage in that. Being one, this piece of clearly being passionate and knowing that this is not a space for what was happening because we know that it wasn't they were selling things and doing and taking advantage of people and all of that. And so at first glance I'm like, oh, he's raging out there. But understanding the context and then also understanding the character of God, I shy away from thinking that's rage and
Yeah.
realize that that is anger because he is righteously and rightfully angry at what they're doing. They're taking advantage of people. They're stealing in the house of God. And what does that one to me, I see Jesus in this moment being moved with compassion to protect
Mhm.
his sheep.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. Looking at it, right, and it can seem like, okay, you just lashing out type of things, but there's a real righteous anger in the last line that says, his disciples remembered, it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. So this is, what is zeal? It's the passion, right? It
Mm-hmm.
is the thing that is like stirring us up, that is causing frustration because of the passion that is behind
Yeah.
it. The passion of understanding that his house is supposed to be a house of prayer. His father's house is a house of prayer. His house is supposed to be considered holy and sacred and set apart. So this anger that I have is really a passion in speaking to, like you said, wanting to protect the sheep, wanting to
Mm-hmm.
protect the sacredness of that temple, of that house. So I am in agreement with that, in regards to that. And anger is something that is unfamiliar to me as well,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of like, I never knew. I've always experienced depression, right?
Yeah.
Depression was something that I was very familiar with, depression and sadness and things like that. But I didn't know that underneath that depression was actually anger.
Mm-hmm.
And it just was turned. So anger, when it turns into depression, is something that's turned inwardly,
Mm-hmm.
versus when it becomes outwardly, it becomes pride
Pride.
type of. And so when it's impaired, so in the space of depression, it pushes, because anger speaks to, uh, like you said, it exposes our passion or our hunger
Mm-hmm.
that we have for life. It's really the most vulnerable feeling. Like you said, it really tells you what you are and what you are not, and
Mm-hmm.
what is not. There's no in between in regards to that. And so when it becomes impaired and it becomes depression, it is in a space where it's pushing your passion back into your heart.
Mm.
It rejects the experience of our yearnings and wishes for things to be different. It is the denial of our heart's truest desire to reach out, right? When you think about when you're
Mm-hmm.
depressed, like, you just go inside of yourself. You're not asking for help. You're not expressing what's on your mind. You're just going very internal. And it's directly related to avoided anger, which takes away from dealing with deeper sadness, loneliness, hurt, or even fear at that point. So depression was something that I was really familiar with. I was like, me
Very.
angry? No, like sadness,
Yeah.
sure, I have you. Like I can tell you about that all through and through. But anger, I don't have anger. And so when anger started coming up, I was like, this is weird. This is suspicious. And then you go into that mode of like, wait, anger is not okay. Like, we're not supposed to be angry, all of the
Yeah.
things like that. But it's actually not true. It's actually
At
not
all.
true. Anger speaks to a lot of things. I want to read this scripture and you kind of give me your points about this. So we have, be angry, but sin not. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. I want to read two different versions of it though.
Okay.
So first is let's go with the message version, which says, um, go ahead and be angry. You do well to be angry, but don't use your anger as fuel for revenge. And don't stay angry. Don't go to bed angry. Don't give the devil that kind of foothold in your life. Ephesians 4:26-27. And then I'm also read the Passion Translation. It says, but don't let the passion of your emotions lead you to sin. But don't let anger control you or be fuel for your revenge, not even for a day. Don't give the slanderous accuser, the devil, an opportunity to manipulate you. And so when I see this, it's like, oh, I could be angry about
Mm-hmm.
things. I can be frustrated about things. It is speaking to a deeper need or speaking to something else, as far as in it becomes an issue when we allow it to control our life. And then now we're living in anger, living in this impaired state of rage, that comes from fear, all of these different things like
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. Like learning to get to that place of being accepting and being okay that I'm actually angry. I'm actually frustrated about this. And what are we doing with that anger? I think is the important thing.
I think that's very important. As you talk about it, um, I know people can use those scriptures and be like, "This is proof why we shouldn't be angry," but it's not so much saying you can't be angry. Like that's necessary. Clearly, Jesus in that scripture you read before was angry. However, it is when we allow that anger to fester or become impaired,
Yeah.
because uh, we all fall short of the glory, and therefore all of us have to continually check our hearts, because when we feel these feelings and our hearts are unchecked, or we're not asking questions about how we're feeling and what other feelings are present along with that anger and where this comes from, then we could start becoming allowing that anger to turn into now resentment and
Mm.
bitterness and pride and depression, like you said, all of these impaired expressions, or of anger or rage and all of these things. It reminds me actually from the book, and I'm actually going to refer to it, where it talks about anger can indicate the need to stop and consider what is happening inside of us. Anger therefore
Yeah.
becomes a warning signal telling us to look inside at what fear, hurt, sadness, or loneliness we are experiencing. Anger also indicates a need to take responsibility for other feelings. Thus, anger will help identify losses, as in sadness, rejections, as in loneliness, wounds, which come with hurt, or limitations that come with fear, and give us the opportunity to tell the truth about what is really going on inside of our hearts. And so, anytime we are feeling any of these feelings, but particularly since we're talking about anger today, having a moment to really find out, okay, this anger is coming up. What else is present here? What is the
Yeah.
root of this? And when we're not checking that, then we can start to look for things externally sometimes, and like look at other people like, oh, it's you, like you're the problem. And so
Yeah.
then that's when the bitterness and resentment starts coming in, because we're really
Yeah.
not checking our hearts for like what is taking place. What are you afraid of? What
Yeah.
just hurt you? Do you feel rejected right now? Like let's talk about this. And in order to do that reflection, that's very vulnerable and very introspective. And then to also be able to share that with somebody else in relationship, that that can be scary. And most of us don't want to do that. And even when I think about going back to rage, as we are talking about, a lot of times, and a lot of us unfortunately saw rage acted out with our caregivers. So, they would lash out, or some unfortunately will cuss them out, or whatever the case may be. You'll get lashed out at, and it's like that rage would happen. But that, as a parent, I know I thank God that I'm not in that space, and the Lord has really helped me check my heart and make sure I'm doing that as I'm raising my child, because I don't want to cause unnecessary damage there. But as I think about it, as a parent, a lot of times when we may lash out at our children, it comes from a place of like we're afraid. Like there's that fear that
Mm.
can take place where it's like, oh, what is this going to lead to? Because they're acting out in this way, and especially as I think about teenagers, and I'm not there. I got a 2-year-old right now, but when I think about teenagers and they're doing things that are like dangerous or scary, or like what is this going to look like later, and then you just lash out because there's this fear in you where it's like, okay, I have to control this situation. I have to make sure you realize how dangerous this is. But there's other ways that we are able to express that with our children or with others, that doesn't, like, we can be honest about how we're feeling instead of having to just lash out in this way that honestly is not received well and could be damaging to the relationship. But it makes me think of that.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about, I want to pull up this scripture um, in Genesis 4. I don't know how many of you know about Cain and Abel in the story in the Bible, but Cain and Abel were born to Adam and Eve. This was after the fall had happened, so sin entered into the world, and the Lord kicked them out of the Garden of Eden. Sad day. And then they had Cain and Abel,
Mm-hmm.
two sons. And so it was a time where it was time to bring an offering unto God. they tilled the ground, so they understood the importance of what to bring to the Lord, right? They understood it. Abel ministered to the Lord in such a way where God was so pleased with his offering that he gave the Lord. Cain kind of just gave him whatever he wanted to give him, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like, you know how like you maybe are in a friendship or a relationship with somebody and they just kind of give you whatever, and it doesn't have any interest to you, doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have any liking, doesn't it just felt like you could feel when somebody doesn't think out what they're giving
What
to
they're
you. It's
giving, yeah.
just here, just take it. And this is to God. This is the God, the creator of the entire earth, right? The entire universe, who is holy and sacred, and you
Mm-hmm.
just kind of give him your sloppy whatevers. And so I want to start at verse 5, Genesis 4, verse 5, which says, but unto Cain, so this was after Abel had gave his offering, and it says, but unto Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. He speaking of God. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. And then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is this face downcast? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, you will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It
Mm-hmm.
desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a whole moment right there of showing how we need to check our heart. And even God expressed to him, like, if you just, he was like, hey, check your heart. What's going on inside your heart?
Mm-hmm.
Reevaluate some things. If you just do the right thing, then you'll be okay. But that speaks to, because he decided not to check his heart, that led
Yeah.
him into other feelings. What else would you say from kind of your perspective or a psychological perspective? What else was going on in this moment?
Jealousy, which is that mixture of fear and anger mixed, and how that can go together. So I see some jealousy there because, like, I deserve this, I'm owed this. Pride,
Yeah.
of course,
Mm-hmm.
is present. Bitterness, resentment. We don't know the full story of their childhood and all of that, but they're uh not trying to add or take away from the Bible, but I'm curious, as you see sibling rivalry and stuff like that, could there have been other times where it's like, here go Abel again, being the good one,
Yeah.
and I have to
Yeah.
be chastised, and so that adds up, and then when you're not checking your heart, you build up resentment toward people, like you're like, not really, and he's not taking responsibility for his feelings and his actions. Where it's like, you could have just made this right. But instead of blaming him, like, oh, so there's comparison there. So those are the things that I see as I'm looking at this, and how when we allow things like pride, bitterness, resentment, and all of that to take place, that's when we start sinning. That's when we
Yeah.
start doing things in our own right. That's when we start seeing justice in our own light, what that means. And for
Mm,
him, justice is get rid of him. Like I'm gonna murder you, I'm gonna kill you, and that's how
yeah.
I'm going to deal with these, with the matters of my. And that does not take care of the issue, because the issue really is him being
Yeah.
disobedient and not being honest about how he's feeling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's good. And now that I'm in the space of where I've really been taking time to really process my feelings, I really have been in this interesting space of just learning to accept all of my feelings.
mm-hmm.
Growing up, I have been told a lot, you're too sensitive, it's not that deep, all of the things, and kind of just get over it, right? Just get over it. And that it led me to a lot of internal depression, right? So a lot
Yeah.
of impaired ways of dealing with my feelings. But now that I've been really walking with Christ and in a space where He's encouraging me constantly to give Him all of my feelings, all of my emotions, and it's okay. And I think I'm finally at a point where I'm okay with accepting um, everything that I feel. And I'm also understanding that there can be multiple feelings happening at one time.
Yeah.
Um, Many can be happening at once, and it all can be true, and it all can be okay. And so just walking through certain journeys. Like I've been dealing with kind of some family issues, and there is this anger that has been rising up in me, and really just anger towards humanity in general, because and it feels so much like righteous anger because I'm really allowing the Lord to consecrate my emotions and my feelings. And it feels like this righteous anger, like stirring up in me. And I think it's cool, like how you see how, like in so many times you see David, who's like, Lord, my enemies are your enemies are my enemies. And, I
Mm-hmm.
hate everybody that rises up against you and splatters and blasphemes your name. Like you see that so many different times and just that zeal. Or you have like, there was a story back when the Israelites were in camp. I don't know exactly where it is. It might be in Numbers, but it got to the point where the Israelites were just disobeying God, like completely all over the place, and they began to intermarry with women who worshiped other gods, and they just did a lot of immoral stuff. And there was this person, I don't know what his name was, but there was this person, and he came with a javelin, which is a spear, and drove it through the woman that this particular person was sleeping with, and through the Israelite as well.
Mm.
And God saw that as honorable. He saw that as honorable because there was a passion, there was a zeal that rose up inside of him, to stand for righteousness, to stand for um, his holiness and what God has already said. Now, I'm not saying go out here and kill people. That's
No,
not what I'm saying,
no, at all.
right? But here you
At all.
he killed his brother and God didn't see it as righteous. But then you see this other person in the camp of Israelites where there was so much immorality going on. The person rose up and he killed it at the root, essentially, what was causing all of the sin and causing all of the disobedience. And God saw it as righteous. And he even honored that and gave it as a covenant of peace. And so where I feel like I'm at is in this space of, as I'm learning to process my feelings with God, and there is this anger that's rising up in me. There's this anger that's really speaking to the passion of wanting people to be righteous, wanting people to be in a space of holiness, wanting people to be in relationship and intimacy with God. God has to go through these extremes to get our attention sometimes.
Yeah.
People get sick, people begin to die, murders happen, like the wars that go on in the world, like all of this stuff. And it's like we don't realize we need Jesus until we realize we need Jesus. And there
Yeah.
is this anger inside of me of like, why is it that way?
Why does it
God
take
is
all
so
that?
gracious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, God is so gracious and he's so patient and he's so kind and he tells us over and over again. He warns us, like you see with Cain. He said, hey, if you just
Yeah.
do the
Chill
right
out.
thing, we'll be good.
Come back. Come
Sin is
back.
right here waiting on you, but you can rule over it. And Cain still decided to go the opposite way.
And
And
do
so even
sins.
in these
Mm-hmm.
moments where this anger is rising up in me, I'm like, okay, Lord, I feel this. Of course, my natural flesh want to like act out in rage and punch and all of these things like that, and just curse people out and whatever. But I give it to God, and then there's a new feeling that comes. Maybe there's some sadness that comes. And then that moves me into compassion to want to intercede, to want to pray for these
Mm.
people that need him, that need to see him, all of these things like that. So it's like there's a difference when you process it with God or when you process
Yeah.
it however God leads you to do it. So if that's through therapy, right? Or if that's through friendships, that's through whatever it is, like taking time to really acknowledge what is going on inside of you. What is it? And then what are you most frustrated about? That you probably need to begin to move in action towards in a way that can facilitate change.
Yeah. I love that because it makes me think of even how our anger, our righteous anger, especially around those who are lost, can lead us into becoming the answer to that, which is being able to go in spaces like even with this podcast, for example, but being able to talk about these things to just help people learn the truth and just start thinking of things differently and being a part of preaching the gospel, wherever you are. So being the light wherever, whatever space you are, it's like knowing that you don't have to necessarily have a platform or a podcast or even a church or anything to preach the gospel or to do this. You can do this with the neighbor. You can do this with the person that sits next to you at work or at school. And so allowing that anger to give you the energy and the boldness to go and do what God is telling you to do and speak and not have the fear of man holding you back. Because at that point, it's like there's souls on the line. Who cares what people think, you know?
No, and I think that's so good because even just thinking about recently, like how that is so good, like how that gives you the boldness to
Mm-hmm.
move toward action, right? In a way that will be honorable, in a way that will be just. Being able to stand before people and be like, hey, listen, get it
Yeah.
together.
Like right
Hey,
now.
listen, this is what we ought to do. That's so good.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Definitely. And with, thinking about, because as you were talking, and I know people can misinterpret the Bible and they go in the Old Testament and they see people sticking people with javelins and then they think it's like, no, that is not what God is telling you to do. Like, come on. Like,
Read
thou
the
should
whole.
not, don't do that. Like, you need to read that in context and calm down. You check your heart. Check your heart. Um, but as I think about, because a lot of people will say like the God of, well, first of all, he the God of the old, new, and all, Testament. But they were like, oh, the God of the Old Testament is so angry, and he was out here just like smiting everybody. But when you really read it within context and start to take the time to really understand the character of God for yourself, and read these things within cultural context and all of that, and the whole chapter, not just the verse and all of that good stuff, start realizing, one, just as we read in Genesis, like how much God, he doesn't just start smiting. He like warns, and he sends several warnings. He will speak to you directly. He will send his prophets. He will send his whoever. Like he does a lot of warnings. He lets you know, like, if you're going to covenant with me, this will bring blessings. This will bring curses. Like he's just so fair in the way he presents everything, so just. And even in the midst of you acting a fool, he's not like, oh, they're acting a fool now. He's like, all right, they're acting a fool. Let me bring this to your attention. This is what's gonna happen. But there's
Yeah,
still time. You can
yeah,
still humble yourself and cry out
yeah,
before me, and I will heal your land. Like he literally is so patient and kind with it. And then finally, because he's Alpha and Omega, so he knows if you're really gonna do it or not. And then at that point, it's like, I gotta kill the root of this. I gotta deal
yeah.
with the root of this, because if I
That's
don't, it's going to spoil the whole
yeah,
situation. And
yeah,
so a lot of what we see in the Old Testament when he was destroying things, he was, first of all, gave warnings and tried his best to save before it even took place. And then when it was taking place, it was because he's destroying the root of it, like you said, which to really help to not spoil everything that was taking place. And there's always a plan for it. And it is not his plan that any should perish. And so understanding his character helps as you read through harder books of the Bible that show, just like the what we call the wrath of God, or the judgments that
yeah,
come upon people as a
yeah,
result of sin.
yeah. Yeah, that's so good. Because going back to like what you said, like going to the root of what the
Mm-hmm.
issue is, like, and that's what a lot of it is. Um, Really, he's the same throughout, but in
Mm-hmm.
the Old Testament, you see it more and more. But even like when you get here, right? Like I'll read this. This is God with Moses, and he has saved his people out of captivity. You know, God has saved his people out of captivity. They're now in this wilderness space, and God is leading them. He's giving them everything they want: food, bread, water, all of the things, all of the necessities. And God expressed to them, hey, these are the commandments. These are what I'm expecting. In order for you to submit under my authority, that also means you're taking on my protection. But when you decide to reject my authority, reject my commandments,
Mm-hmm.
then you're no longer going to be in a space of protection. And that's what happens when we get to this space where now all of this sin and all of this stuff is happening. And so even reading here, when Moses was on the mountain with God, getting all the commandments and stuff, the people decided to go against God once again.
Mm-hmm.
And it says here in Exodus 32:10, now leave me alone. This is God talking to Moses. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. I will make you into a great nation. Then I will make you into a great nation. So how many times has he told them, like, hey, listen, listen, stop, don't do this, do that, do this, do that, do this, do that, do this, do that. Like those of you are parents, those of you are teachers, I'm sure.
You know
Okay.
about that
And
all too well.
at some point, People don't believe fat meat is greasy. Ain't that what the old people say?
Oh my gosh, girl. You went back in the day. Okay.
And at some point, you gotta discipline people for their actions,
Yeah, they
right?
gotta learn.
And so,
They gotta learn.
with that, and then you keep going further. Then you get to the point of in Numbers 25, like I talked about, they began to, because God told them, don't be sexually immoral, don't do this, don't do that. By the time you get to Numbers 25, where I talked about where the guy he drove the spear through the Midianite woman and through the Israelite, and that was the root. That was the root of the issue because they started
Yeah.
to sin. So I just think that this emotion is an emotion that can really lead you strongly into one side or the other very quickly, good or bad. Anger can really lead us into a really like dramatic space. It really can, if we're not taking the time to properly process it. It can be very impaired or it can be very healthy, and helping you identify what's going on. Um,
Absolutely.
Even sometimes that we have times where we could be angry with God.
Yeah.
Kind of what are your thoughts in regards to that?
That's a big one. As I think about that, I think about examples in my own life as well as the just Job's life as he was just really still trusting and saying like, throughout the chapter, like yeah, throughout the book, not the chapter. Just, God is saying who God is, but then also questioning who God is at the same time, like what with what was happening. And from like a personal standpoint, being angry at God does happen because anger in relationship does happen. So, of
Hmm.
course, we're in relationship with God, we're going to get disappointed. And the
Yeah.
main reason why we get angry with God is because our understanding is just not His. Our ways of doing things is just not His. And so, how we would bring people together, how we would do the timing of our lives and other people's lives is going to be different. It just is. And we think it's good because our judgment and good is kind of honestly relative, but his is not relative. It's consistent. Ours is relative because we get swayed by, feelings, emotions, what's going on, the culture, blah, blah, blah. His standard has never changed from Genesis all the
Yeah.
way through Revelation, which is good. And that's why we can trust him
Yeah.
because he's not fickle like us. He doesn't
Yeah.
all of a sudden grow weary in well doing. We do. We grow weary. We're like, you know what? I'm
Yeah.
tired of being nice to you. You're gonna get this cuss out today. Like not me though. Like, thank you, Lord, for sanctifying me in that area. But like that's how people are. We grow weary. We're like, we're done. I'm done with you. That's not him.
Yeah.
So I feel like because of that, and because all of us struggle with that, whether we like to admit it or not, there's going to come a time where he disappoints us, where he is slaying us, and we are struggling to trust him. Like it's just gonna happen, and we're gonna get angry because something happened that we asked this and we got that, and that's not what we wanted. And so in those moments, it is so vital that we process that with him. Because if we don't, we run the risk of that anger now turning into something that is impaired.
Yeah.
And we run the risk of really isolating ourselves from the one person or not from God, which we need him in order to heal from whatever took place, in order to understand fully whatever took place, or to begin to understand, or just understand him enough so that we can trust him. Because sometimes we're not going to understand why. We're not going to get our answers of why. It's okay to ask that, but we're not going to always get the answers. We're not always going to fully understand on this side of heaven. And that's okay. um well, we can feel like it's okay when we start to really trust that he knows best, and that we continue to allow those times where when we're in the valley to build our faith in who God, and build our faith and understanding of who God is. Because the more
Yeah.
we do that, the relatively easier, it's not easy, I'm not going to try to say it's easy, but the relatively easier it is to trust him in the valley, to trust
Yeah.
him when we're walking through the valley of shadow of death, like in those places, to better trust that his way is best. And that is so hard to trust that his way is best, especially in those moments when we're going through things that it's like this doesn't make sense. And I think the trigger areas the most are around health and life and death situations. Like those type of situations are the hardest ones to trust that he is best. Because if we're
Yeah.
praying for a certain outcome and it doesn't happen, it's just like, Lord, that couldn't have been the plan. Like what is
Yeah.
this? Like what is
Yeah.
happening? But I believe those moments are places where we can learn to trust him more. And just like in chapter 42 of Job, where he's like, I heard you with my ears, but now I can see you. Like I can really see who you are. And in those moments, God is really trying to show you who he is so that you can
Yeah.
be anchored in him, planted by the river of living water, like anchored. And so those moments are for anchoring. However, we know that the enemy has a plan for those times too. And because he knows how our emotions are and our feelings can become impaired and our hearts can be, unchecked, then he uses those times to isolate us from God, to have us throwing our fist at him, all of these things, and breaking and tearing down that relationship instead of doing what it's really meant to do, which is to build it stronger. And
Yeah.
he does that not only with God, but also with people around us too. But yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
How
Sorry.
would you say, like, with clients that you walk through, just kind of as a therapist, like, how do you walk people through who experience such anger, and maybe not understanding what to do with those? Like, what does that look like practically to walk it out and process it and all of the things?
So overall, it looks like what we were talking about before, which is like understanding the root. Like, what is the root of this? What other feelings are present?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times anger doesn't come alone. Like it has fear and all of these and hurt and feelings of rejection and which comes from the feeling of loneliness and so really wanting to put those things on the table and identify them, name the fear, name what we are actually afraid of, name all of the things. Because if we can name it, then we can deal with it, and
Yeah,
we
that's
can
good.
really, so either we can learn the truth of what's happening, because sometimes we have assumption and lies that we believe are truth, and it keeps us bound. And so in those areas, it's like understanding the truth of it, like what's really happening, and processing that, and then encouraging the person, also if they are a person of faith, then I will incorporate that piece into it as well, because that is like really introducing them and walking through what that looks like to process these feelings, not only with me as their therapist but also with God, and how they can really bring that relationship, to get like closer instead of allowing this to tear it apart.
Mm-hmm.
And then also not only with God, but also with people around them as well. Because a lot of times when we're going through this, isolation tends to feel like the best thing, and it's not. So
Yeah,
isolating ourselves from others and then isolating ourselves from God. And this is a process. So that's like the overall, but this is not something that happens overnight. And depending on how
yeah,
much you're dealing with and how deeply rooted those roots are, it's going to look different in how I approach it. But overall, when I have someone come in and this is what I'm seeing, that is like the overall like treatment plan, if you will. It's like, okay, how can I get all of these feelings on the table, name what's going on, help them and help us together discover what the roots are here, and then start helping them strengthen, like leveraging the therapeutic relationship to then help them with relationships outside that are being affected by this, and then also how
yeah,
their faith and their relationship with God in particular is being affected by this as well.
yeah. That's good. That's beautiful. So we don't have to be afraid of anger.
At
We
all.
just need to um, pay attention to it
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and let
Ask
it direct.
questions.
Ask questions.
Be
Yeah.
curious. Always be curious. I think overall, as we've talked about this, it always goes back to like checking your heart and being curious about these things and not being afraid of being vulnerable and honest about what's coming up for you. Not wondering like how it has to sound, or oh, this doesn't sound right, or this is not good. Like
Mhm.
those are assumptions. Like, how about we just let it out and find out? So I think it's really important as I think through this, it goes back to being curious, asking questions, and being honest with self and others, and being vulnerable. Mhm.
Yeah, that's good. This is a good conversation.
Yes. And so I'm so thankful for this. And so I'm hoping that you all are able to take some nuggets from today's conversation about anger and to really allow yourself to feel fully. And that's really our goal with this. And so we love you guys. Thank you so much for listening. And we'll be back again on Thursday. Have a good one. Bye. Love you.